Have you noticed what's quietly happening in West Africa? The United States is suddenly deepening its ties with Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Yes, those same countries now led by military governments. The same ones that expelled the French and aligned themselves with Russia, the so-called enemy of the West. So why the sudden US interest? What changed? And more importantly, what does Washington stand to gain? For years, the Western media has pushed a narrow, damaging narrative about Africa. To them, it's a continent of hunger, dirt, and chaos. A place that always needs help, a burden. If you ask the average American what they think of Africa, many will say the US is wasting billions in aid, that America is giving and Africa is just taking. But here's the uncomfortable truth. They're only seeing part of the picture. Because the real question is, does the US truly gain nothing from this so-called aid? Or is there a bigger game being played? Why is it that, time after time, it's the West that flies into African capitals with promises of partnerships, financial assistance, and strategic deals? Is it really about helping, or is it about controlling the narrative and the resources? The US isn't just randomly building relationships with military regimes tied to Russia. There's a reason, a motive. And as we dig deeper, the answers start to reveal a much larger strategy, one the world isn't ready to talk about. Let's be honest, no country, especially not the United States, does anything without protecting its own interests. The aid sent to Africa? It's not charity, it's strategy. It benefits Washington far more than it helps the average African. Because the reality is this, the West takes far more from Africa than it gives. That's the first point. Now let's talk about the second. We all remember what happened after the military takeovers in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The US didn't just disapprove, it reacted with fury. And in Niger, things got especially tense. Behind the scenes, Washington was seriously considering a military intervention. The goal? To force General Tiani to hand power back to Mohamed Bazoum, a leader seen by many as a French puppet. Yes, an actual invasion. But then came hesitation. Maybe they realized the backlash that would follow. Maybe they feared igniting a regional war. Either way, the official plan was shelved, but not entirely. Instead, the US threw its full support behind ECOWAS, encouraging them to intervene militarily. We remember how the US applauded Nigerian President Bola Tinubu for taking a strong stance in defense of democracy. But then something unexpected happened. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea all stepped forward. They stood behind Niger, firmly, and just like that, the idea of war began to look a lot more dangerous. A regional conflict was brewing, and the West wasn't ready for the storm it had helped create. That's when everything changed. After that failed attempt at force, the US changed its approach. This time, it chose diplomacy, but not the respectful kind. Fueled by its usual superiority complex, Washington tried to issue orders. It demanded that Niger return to civilian rule. It insisted that any ties with Russia be cut off. Only then, it said, could defense cooperation continue. But something unexpected happened. Niger didn't flinch. Instead of submitting, the military government stood firm. The result? The US was forced to pack up and leave. It withdrew its troops. It lost access to its most expensive drone base in Africa. And just like that, the illusion of American control in Niger began to crumble. The reality hit hard, because here's the truth. If Niger had been ruled by a Western-backed civilian government, they likely would have given in. They would have bowed under pressure. But General Tiani and his government didn't. They recognized something too many leaders forget: sovereignty. And that changed everything. That's how diplomatic relations between Niger and the United States came to an abrupt end. And it didn't stop there. The same story unfolded in Burkina Faso. In Mali, the US made the same threats. No aid, no diplomacy, no relations, unless power was returned to civilians. But the military governments didn't blink. They knew who they were, and they knew what was at stake. But guess what? Since Donald Trump returned to power, the United States has started to walk back its earlier stance. In May 2025, the US quietly reopened the door to Niger by sending a new ambassador, Kathleen Fitzgibbon. She formally presented her credentials to President Abdourahmane Tiani, marking a significant thaw in what had been a tense diplomatic freeze. This move came as a surprise, considering that in 2023, After her Senate confirmation, the US publicly announced she wouldn't take up the role due to Niger's military-led government. Even more telling, the US Embassy in Niger resumed its consular services in March 2025 after suspending them in December 2024. Just a month later, on April 25th, Niger's Prime Minister, Ali Mahamani Lamine Zain, traveled to Washington to meet with US Ambassador Troy Fitrell. Their discussions weren't about restoring democracy, they were about strengthening political, economic, and trade relations. It's as if the US has quietly erased its earlier position of non-engagement with Niger's military rulers, and Niger isn't the only case. Just days ago, the United States made a similar move with Mali. Rudolph Atala, a top US counterterrorism official, landed in Bamako. Alongside US Ambassador Rachna Korhonen, he spent 3 days meeting with Mali's Foreign Minister Abdoulaye Diop and the Minister of Security. The topic? Re-establishing security cooperation between the two countries. This is the same Mali that was once denounced by Washington. The same Mali the US said it would never work with unless it returned to civilian rule. So what's changed? Why is the US suddenly warming up to governments it once condemned? We'll answer that next. During the working session in Bamako, both parties dove deep into the region's security challenges. The conversations focused on Mali's plans to resume defense cooperation, strengthening the operational capacity of its security forces, and the critical role of the Confederation of Sahel States, AES, in the ongoing fight against terrorism. On the surface, it looked like a standard diplomatic exchange. But here's where things got interesting. Unlike many civilian-led governments, Mali didn't shrink in front of the United States. There was no bowing, no begging. The transitional authorities were clear, firm. They had demands of their own. Mali raised a serious concern, one that's rarely spoken aloud on international platforms. They pointed directly at the double game being played in the Sahel. They accused some countries, Western allies no less, of providing support to the very terrorist groups destabilizing the region. And they didn't speak in vague terms. According to Malian officials, countries like Ukraine have at times supplied assistance to rebel fighters in the Sahel, and they made it clear, any future cooperation with the United States would depend on Washington's willingness to address this issue. In plain terms, Mali told the US, "We know what's going on, and we won't play along unless you clean it up." This wasn't just a conversation about security. It was a message of sovereignty, of strength, and a quiet but powerful warning to Washington. But Mali wasn't finished. In that same meeting, Malian authorities made one thing crystal clear. They would not sever ties with Russia. Not now, not ever. Whether or not relations with the US resumed was irrelevant. Russia was a strategic partner, and that partnership wasn't up for negotiation. To that, the US response was surprisingly diplomatic. The American representative acknowledged that Mali had the sovereign right to choose its own alliances. He said the United States was open to supporting Mali, if Mali wanted that support. He also emphasized the need for national reconciliation, hinting that peace and internal unity were essential for long-term stability and economic investment. Still, both sides agreed on something rare: dialogue. According to the official report, Mali and the United States expressed a mutual willingness to continue political discussions, aiming for what they called a pragmatic and mutually beneficial partnership. No more demands, no ultimatums, just negotiation based on respect. Rudolph Atala, the senior deputy director for counterterrorism at the White House, also weighed in. He called Mali a key player in regional stabilization. He expressed Washington's desire to work not only with Mali, but with the broader Confederation of Sahel states. The threat of terrorism, he said, remains dangerously high, and Mali in particular is exposed. That, he argued, is why strengthening Mali's defense capabilities is no longer optional. It's a striking shift from the hardline stance the US once held. The same country that vowed to cut off ties now sits at the table, calling Mali a partner. So the question remains, why the sudden change? What is the US really after? We're getting close to the answer. At the end of the meeting, the message from Mali was loud and clear. The Malian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement that said, "The visit reflects the willingness of both parties to explore ways of collaboration in respect of national sovereignty and Malian priorities." Did you catch that? The United States, once quick to dictate terms, is now agreeing to cooperate on Mali's terms, respecting Mali's sovereignty, prioritizing Mali's interests. That's a major shift. Because traditionally, U.S. relations with African nations have followed a different playbook, one that often ignored sovereignty and pushed American interests first. But now, that playbook is being rewritten. And Mali isn't alone. Just like in Bamako, Washington is now making moves in Ouagadougou. In May of this year, President Donald Trump sent a special envoy to Burkina Faso. The mission: reopen diplomatic doors that were once slammed shut. Standing before Burkina Faso's leadership, the envoy delivered a message straight from the White House. "I come today with a message from President Donald Trump," he said, "to work together to build a pragmatic relationship based on mutual respect and respect for the sovereignty of each country. We can collaborate with each other, work together to meet the challenges, and improve our relationships." That's not the language of a superpower giving orders. That's the language of a superpower trying to regain trust. And once again, the question rises: why now? Why is the United States suddenly ready to talk, respect, and rebuild? The answer is more revealing than you think. During the discussion, Burkina Faso's Foreign Minister, Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré, welcomed the new tone from Washington. He acknowledged that President Trump had done something rare. He sent an envoy directly to the field to listen, not just lecture. That, Minister Traoré said, was a step in the right direction. But he didn't stop there. Without mincing words, Traoré made Burkina Faso's new position clear. The era of one-sided partnerships was over. From now on, Burkina Faso would only work with nations that respected its sovereignty and supported its path to development. In simple terms, no more deals that treat the country like a pawn. And then came the words that echoed across the room. "As Burkinabe, as Sahelians, and as Africans," he said, "we want mutual respect and respect for our sovereignty. Africa is a continent like any other, and Africans are human beings like the others. We want a change in perspective. We want to be understood. No more frustrating speeches. No more superiority. Just equal ground and partnerships based on fairness." Minister Traoré also addressed the elephant in the room: Burkina Faso's ongoing struggle with terrorism. He expressed deep frustration that, because of rigid policies and political bias, countries like the United States have blocked African nations from acquiring the weapons and equipment they desperately need to defend themselves. And that's when the U.S. representative responded. The Deputy Undersecretary of State, in office since January 2025, didn't argue. Instead, he made a promise. He said he would personally work to unlock this bottleneck so that the fight against terrorism and the financial networks behind it could move forward in the region. It was a powerful moment. A moment that symbolized a shift, not just in tone, but in strategy. The United States, long used to calling the shots in Africa, is now sitting at the table as an equal. Because in the Sahel, a new message is rising: respect us or be left behind. So here's the real question: why did the United States block Burkina Faso's access to weapons in the first place? The answer is as political as it is strategic. The U.S. didn't approve of the military government, so it chose to punish. But now the narrative has changed. Suddenly, the U.S. wants to unblock those restrictions. Why? Because it's becoming clear. Washington is losing its grip on the Sahel. You see, the U.S. is used to a certain kind of response. When it makes a decision, it expects African leaders to comply, without question. Take South Africa, for example. When Donald Trump accused the country of harming white farmers and suspended aid, what did the South African president do? He went to explain himself. Despite all the bold speeches, he still went to plead his case. That's not leadership, that's submission. But President Ibrahim Traoré, he chose a different path. When Burkina Faso's access to weapons was cut off, Traoré didn't beg. He didn't send diplomats to plead for favors. He simply found alternatives. He looked elsewhere for partnerships. He stood his ground. And in the end, it wasn't Traoré who came crawling back. It was the United States. That tells you everything you need to know. The truth is, it's not Africa that needs the West. It's the West that needs Africa. The day African leaders embrace that reality is the day this continent begins to transform. So now, let's come full circle. Why is the United States so desperate to rebuild diplomatic bridges with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso? The answer is simple: Russia. Because in the new balance of power, where Moscow is gaining ground and the Sahel is taking control of its own destiny, the US is realizing something it never wanted to admit. It's no longer the only game in town. Before the military governments came to power in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the United States held deep, unshakable ties with their civilian regimes. Washington, alongside France, was the dominant security partner in the region. Russia wasn't even part of the conversation. But everything changed when the soldiers took over. The West's immediate hostility toward these new military leaders forced a shift. These governments were isolated, sanctioned, and politically cornered. So, they did what any sovereign power would do. They looked elsewhere. And what they found was a willing partner in Russia. That moment marked the beginning of a new era. A non-Western alliance was born. One built not on dependency, but on strategic cooperation. As ties with Moscow strengthened, Western influence began to crumble. France's power in the region weakened, and then came a bold move. Niger expelled US troops and shut down Washington's most expensive drone base in the Sahel. The message was loud and clear, and Niger wasn't alone. Chad soon followed, kicking out US forces and cutting defense ties altogether. One by one, the old colonial grip of the West loosened. This wasn't just a diplomatic shift, it was a continental statement. Africa is changing, the Sahel is rising, and the West is being left behind. It was at this point that reality hit the United States. It began to realize it was losing influence in Africa, fast. And in the vacuum it left behind, Russia was stepping in. What started in the Sahel quickly spread beyond. Countries across West Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa, and even Eastern Africa began turning to Moscow. For Washington, this was more than a diplomatic setback. It was a strategic crisis. Russia is the United States' biggest rival on the global stage. For years, the US has tried everything to isolate Moscow. Sanctions, political pressure, global narratives. But time and again, Russia has broken through. It adapts. It evolves. And now, it's expanding its footprint across a continent the West once thought it controlled. Instead of collapsing in isolation, Russia is thriving, and Africa has become its next frontier. This matters, because Africa is no longer just viewed as a battleground for aid and politics. It's being seen as the engine of the next industrial revolution. With its vast resources, young population, and untapped potential, Africa is the key to future global dominance. Analysts are warning, any nation that ignores Africa will be left behind, and the United States knows it. That's why Washington is now rushing to rebuild ties with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Not because it's had a change of heart, but because it wants to stop Russia. It wants to regain control. It's not about democracy, it's not about aid, it's about power. And the battle for Africa has just begun. Interestingly, it's not just the US. Even the EU has made attempts to rebuild ties with the Sahel. For instance, some months back, the European Union sent its delegates to Burkina Faso to discuss the possibility of resuming diplomatic ties. What's more interesting is the fact that it was the EU that suspended cooperation with Burkina Faso. But when they realized that their suspension did nothing to Traore's administration, they decided to swallow their pride and send delegates to Burkina Faso. At the end of the meeting, the European Union envoy noted that, "I had the opportunity to exchange with the Prime Minister. The meetings were very useful. Now we must continue the dialogue, a dialogue that never stops. As far as there are ideas, objectives of the government of Burkina Faso, and on our part too," he said. With all this, it's clear that it's the West that needs Africa and not the other way around. If Africa wasn't important, they would not be scrambling around trying to outbid each other on who should have the greatest influence in the region. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.